Hey, Joe.
What's up, Tim?
In the movie we watched for the podcast, On the Beach, our characters waited nervously for a lethal cloud of radioactive fallout to reach their shores in Australia after a nuclear war. While I haven't experienced that personally, I do remember watching presidential election returns on election night in 2016, so probably, basically the same thing.
Tim, I think you're being super critical.
Welcome to another episode of the Supercritical Podcast, where we delve into the fun and oftentimes nonsensical way pop culture portrays nuclear weapons. My name is Tim Westmyer, someone who studies nuclear weapons and works on nuclear nonproliferation for a living. I'm joined today in the podcast studio over Zoom with my special co-host for the episode, Joe Cirincione, distinguished fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, former president of the Ploughshares Fund, and my former professor at Georgetown. Joe, welcome.
Thank you, Tim. It's a pleasure to be here.
Excellent. Well, Joe is a big fan of the movie we're going to talk about today, the 1959 film On the Beach, so I'm excited to have you here. This story is a group of Americans and Australians waiting for a lethal cloud of radioactivity to reach Melbourne, Australia, after World War III went nuclear in the distant future of, I think, 1964, so a couple years in the future in the movie time. So our characters have a couple of months to contemplate their fates and the nature of nuclear war. Not necessarily a fun, happy movie, but Joe, what drew you to this particular film? What is your history with the book and the film?
Well, like you, Tim, I'm a fan of nuclear-themed movies, and you've covered a lot of them in this podcast, including some of my favorites like Them, 7 Days in May, others. But I look at these films like they're time capsules from the past. They don't just help us explore these themes, which in this case they do very well, but it brings us back to the time itself, to the mores, the technology, the expectations, and of course the physical place of the film. And this is a 60-year-old film, so it's a deep trip back in time, but its themes still resonate with us today, particularly during this pandemic, where here we are, and for a year, we have been awaiting the inevitable arrival of particles we can't see or touch or feel, but could kill us. Why is this happening to us? What could we have done to prevent it? Whose fault is it? And all these themes come up anew, even to the scene you remember near the end of the movie where they're waiting in line for the medical pills. It's like waiting in line for vaccinations. But more than that, the film takes direct aim at the flawed theory of nuclear deterrence. And I hope we'll discuss that as we go along. And finally, I like this film because it looks at the effects of nuclear war from the point of view of the victims. Even if we don't see the physical destruction, we feel the dread, we feel the sense of helplessness. The military are not the villains in this movie, but they're certainly not the heroes either. In this case, the military involved in the film had no direct role in the war, so you're allowed to see them as sympathetic figures, not evil figures. So for all those reasons, I'm fascinated by this film. I think it still resonates with audiences today.
Which is going to be really interesting when we talk about how much pushback this movie got during production from the military, from the Eisenhower White House. Certainly, even though the characters are described as you mentioned, you wouldn't get that from how much pushback there was. Note for the listeners, we're going to cover the original 1959 movie and a bit about the 1957 book by Neville Shute, who was a Australian-British writer who had previously worked as an aeronautical engineer, including building some weapons, I believe, during World War II. It was also remade in the 2000 movie. I don't know if you've seen that one. I haven't seen it yet, but I heard it's not great. So it's on the bottom of my list here to check out. This was directed by Stanley Kramer, who's known for some great films like The Defiant Ones, Judgment at Nuremberg, and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. And it's got quite a cast, a big movie cast. Gregory Peck, Ava Gardner, Anthony Perkins, people who may know as Norman Bates from
Psycho,
here we go. And then Fred Astaire. One interesting fact is this is what Stanley Kramer would do to get a movie that he would consider maybe a little bit more of a moral tale, a little bit more of a message, heavy laden message. He tried to get those show's done and filmed and watched by the people by having big name people like this. If you got them
Right.
get their butts in the seats and get the money in the bank.
And Kramer had already had a number of successful films under his belt in exactly this mold. Remember, he casts Tony Curtis and Sidney Poitier as two guys on the run that are chained to each other in The Defiant Ones, exploring racism, but again, big names. He goes on to do Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? Again, Spencer Tracy, Katharine Hepburn, big names to draw the audience in to take on what was then very controversial themes, in this case, interracial marriage.
And it works. It got the movie done. It was I think the book was considered to be quite a big success, sold millions of copies. The movie was a big release. It was premiered on 6 continents at the same time, including Moscow, all around the world. It didn't make a ton of money in the theater. I think it had lost around like 700,000, but it was certainly a movie that's left a huge impact on the public and a huge impact on our community, nuclear people, nuclear nonproliferation experts, people who work in this field.
And it had political impact at the time. And if you go up to YouTube to watch this movie, which is where we watched it, you can also see the original trailer, which shows you the, prime ministers and heads of government all over the world coming to see this movie. And it had a political impact. Some people believe that it helped spur disarmament talks in the United Nations. This is about the time the country started talking about the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. So this film may not have been a box office bonanza, but it was a very effective political device, doing pretty much what Kramer hoped it would do.
Yeah, and even just one individual, an Australian young anti-nuclear activist and pediatrician, Dr. Helen Caldecott, noted that this was something that frightened her as a youth and inspired her and her career. And so certainly has had its impact.
Right. So Helen Caldecott, I think she's 19 when she sees this film. And she
Wild.
goes on to found the Positions for Social Responsibility, was a moving force in the nuclear freeze movement. So this was historically, this may be one of the more impactful films that you're covering in your podcast series.
And I'm glad that you're here with it so we can get into the plot here. This is going to be a little bit different than our normal episodes where we'll do a 2-hour deep dive on a plot, because sometimes there are movies where people haven't seen them and we cover films that we don't necessarily even recommend you see. But it's interesting for people who are interested in this field. But this is one I think, Joe and I would agree we should definitely recommend people watch this movie.
Yeah, let me just tell you about this. I mean, it's an old film, right? So it has long shots. It feels very European, but it really takes you back there. It grounds you in this film. And for me, this was like a glass of good wine. You taste it, you think this is good, but then a few minutes later, you realize you still have it. It lingers with you. It stays with you. I've been thinking about this film for days since I saw it, and I think others will too.
Yeah, it's like the scene in the movie where there's these 2 older gentlemen at a country club, and they're talking about how they're not going to have enough time to drink all the port that was ordered for the club, and it was very irresponsible for the owner of the club to buy this much port, knowing that this kind of nuclear war could happen. So take your time, watch this movie, open up a glass of port, and really enjoy it. But we'll give you the quick major points that you'll need to know to follow along here in our discussion.
Flash! Motion picture history is made as Stanley Kramer's production of On the Beach opens all over the world in unprecedented 6-continent premieres and meets with unprecedented success as critics everywhere hail it as a motion picture milestone.
So like I said, it's a 1959 movie. It opens in the far distant future of 1964. We are on board the USS Sawfish, which is in the story, a U.S. nuclear-powered naval submarine commanded by Dwight Towers, which is Gregory Peck, and they order the crew to surface near Australia. And we're not really sure what's up here. It could just be one of those typical 1950s submarine movies. There's quite a number of them. But then we learn, actually, no, this is something really serious, because there's someone in a lighthouse listening to a radio program that describes that the nuclear war is over.
And our scientists disagree as to when radiation will reach Australia. The atomic war has ended, but the Prime Minister reports no proof of survival of human life anywhere except here.
And we learn that this is Australia, where they've got about 5 months before a radioactive fallout cloud reaches them, and pretty much anywhere else in the northern hemisphere of the world is unreachable. No one knows what's going on there. And this is an interesting point, Joe. We don't really know in the movie. We get a little bit of discussion here and there, but we don't really know a lot of details about what happened with the war. We just know that it happened, and the submarine is one of the few American military, American naval vessels that are left.
Yeah, in the book, it fills in some of those details. It indicates that the war started from a Russian-NATO conflict that morphed into a Russia-China war that then begins, and then other countries come in. It involves Egypt, for example, and that the whole thing was sort of a case of mistaken identity. The Egyptians used nuclear weapons to attack the United States using Russian bombers, and the U.S., in the haste to respond, this rush that they feel they have to respond right away, believes that it's Russia that attacked them. They nuke Russia. The whole thing escalates from there. So you do get a few more details in the book. In the movie, it's just left vague. It was a mistake, a misunderstanding that triggers the war, which of course remains the fear that a nuclear war would start not on purpose, but by miscalculation, by accident or madness.
And we see some of the people that are affected by that had nothing to do with this war that was fought in the Northern Hemisphere. We meet a couple, an Australian naval lieutenant, Peter Holmes, who prepares a bottle of milk for his newborn baby and a cup of tea for his wife, Mary. And it's very clear they're both putting on a brave face, but they know something's coming, and they're not really sure what's going to happen. You know, what are they going to do with a newborn child that's now here? And particularly milk is always something that is very strong associations with nuclear danger that are starting to develop with strontium-90 that from nuclear testing was starting to get in the news here about very dangerous for milk. I think this really puts a really human face immediately on this, particularly people who were not involved in the actual fighting of the war. We see a little bit of the streets of Melbourne. Everything seems to be fine in terms of from a physical damage standpoint, but there aren't any sort of cars really working anymore. Everyone's walking or riding horses or things like that because everything is really breaking down. And we get quick shots here of kind of what's happening. We know that Peter, from earlier, he now is assigned to join Dwight Towers on the USS Sawfish, and they're going to go on a 2-month mission. They're going to do basically 2 main things. They're going to go to Alaska, I believe, up the Arctic, and see if radiation might be starting to dissipate. They got this theory, wind and rain and snow might cause the fallout to drop quicker and won't get to Australia. They might be able to make it. And there's also this very mysterious signal. They're getting some kind of a Morse code out of San Diego, I believe, and they're trying to figure out what is this. It's not making any sort of actual message. They're just hearing beep and beeps, and every once in a while there might be an actual word, but they're not sure. But it could be life.
The damnedest thing. Started day before yesterday.
Came on again 10 minutes ago, sir.
Starts and stops. I've monitored about 60 hours so far.
It's weird. You sure it's from San Diego?
Within a 100-mile radius, sir.
Could be a kid. Somebody who doesn't know Morse.
Well, we've made 2 words up to now, sir. Water and connect. But this interests me. There has to be an explanation for it, and I'd like to know what it is. How would you like to track it down?
I'd like it, sir.
Very well, then.
They want to go out and check this out. But before they do, we start to get introduced to a few more characters that are really important here. You want to talk a little bit about Maura Davis and how she gets introduced?
Well, Morris, the date for the captain, for Dwight. Peter Holmes decides that Dwight is such a sad figure and he's going to be serving with him on this sub mission that he should invite him to the house and they should have a party for him and they should comfort him. His wife is a little leery of this because these Northerners, these North Americans tend to get very morose. They cry. They, of course, lost their lives. They've lost all their families.
Including Dwight, a wife and some kids, yeah.
Yeah, so in Dwight Cates, 2 kids, lives in Connecticut, where I grew up, by the way, near the New London subbase. He lives in Mystic, Connecticut. They decide that they need to cheer him up. Let's have a party. And of course, this being the time when it is, you don't just have single people come to your parties. You have to match them up. There has to be an equal number of men and women, couples. And for this case, they invite their friend, Maura, to come be his companion and to distract him. And she's a heavy drinker. In the book, she's sort of depicted as a real alcoholic, like drinking at breakfast. It's not quite that bad in the movie, but a sort of a fun person, a hedonist, says one movie reviewer. And she does her job. She completely entertains him and tries to seduce him.
Yeah, but at this dinner party, it's not just drinking and having fun. Everybody has the war and the fallout of the war on their minds. There's a big debate, as you have at dinner parties after a nuclear war. People talk talk about what happened. Was it an accident? Was it miscalculation? Was it a computer vacuum tube that messed up? Was it a computer chip? All the things that we worry about during the Cold War and today that might cause some of these problems that aren't direct, purposeful attack with a nuclear force. And there's questions, right? Is it the military who fought the war? Is it the scientists? Are they to blame? They built the bombs. Is it the governments, those who ordered the bombs to be created and used? And one particular scientist is really interesting here. His name is Julian Osborne. He's the character played by Fred Astaire. And he's a little bit tipsy, but he's letting his thoughts go.
You mean to tell me this whole damn war was an accident?
No. It wasn't an accident. I didn't say that. It was carefully planned, down to the tiniest mechanical and emotional detail. But it was a mistake. In the end, somehow granted the time for examination, we shall find that our so-called civilization was gloriously destroyed by a handful of vacuum tubes and transistors, probably 40.
Ah, there you are, Julian, there you are. Now we know where the blame lies, don't we?
No, maybe we were the blind mechanics of disaster, but you don't pin the guilt on the scientists that easily. You might as well pin it on motherhood.
Well, it should be pinned on somebody. And you scientists are the likely ones as far as I can see. You built the bomb. You experimented with it, tested it, and exploded it.
Now, just a moment more.
Thanks to you chaps, a moment is about all we have.
Every man who ever worked on this thing told you what would happen. The scientists signed petition after petition. Please. But nobody listened. There was a choice. It was build the bombs and use them, or risk that the United States, the Soviet Union, and the rest of us would find some way to go on living.
Huh. That's wishful thinking if ever I heard it.
They signed petitions. They called on the bombs to be destroyed. He gets really upset. He says everyone is doomed because of the fallout, and that kind of puts a really big damper on the party here. But did this remind you, Joe, of anyone else in terms of people like some of these scientists that were involved in the Manhattan Project that later on, once the war was over, once the justification of having to build a bomb before the German Nazi military did, they had these petitions to try to rein in the arms race and try to not build, say, a hydrogen bomb, those thermonuclear bombs?
Absolutely. I mean, this is like Leo Szilard, who was one of the physicist on the Manhattan Project, who goes on to found the Council for a Livable World, or people, the Los Alamos scientists who went on to found the Federation of American Scientists. I mean, there was enormous agitation after this by the scientists who, remember, invented the bomb as a deterrent. They never thought we would ever use the bomb. It was all supposed to stop Hitler from using the bomb because we thought Hitler was racing to build one, a flawed intelligence, as we all now know. He didn't have a bomb. Nobody else had a program. If we didn't have the Manhattan Project, it would have been fine. But these scientists go build the bomb. Then they see it used and they're appalled by what happens. And there's a split in the scientific community. Some go to build more bombs and others are trying to stop them from ever being used again. That's the kind of character Julian represents. He regrets his role in building the bomb.
The more I think about it, he is a stand-in a bit for the author of the book, Neville Shute, who was involved as an aerospace engineer building weapons of war. It wouldn't be that crazy to think that he was Julian's a bit of a stand-in for him. And even though that he signed the petitions that we shouldn't build new weapons, they still have to reconcile with the fact that they were maybe involved in somehow.
And it's, that's true for so many of us. I mean, those of us who work on national security in Washington, we believe that we're working on national security for defensive purposes, to protect the country. And yet the machine that we built, this military industrial complex, causes tremendous harm in the world. And what is our moral responsibility? For those of us who are participating in this enterprise, what is our moral responsibility here? That's some of the themes you see resonating in this film.
And Maura has the same questions. She says, to Dwight, after this particular conversation takes place during the party, she says to Dwight, all I want to know is, if everyone was so smart, why didn't they know what would happen? And Dwight basically responds, to the question of, if everyone's so smart, why didn't they know what would happen? Dwight simply says back, they did.
All I want to know is, if everybody was so smart, why didn't they know what would happen?
They did.
Yeah, this is actually a key point. And although there isn't, elaborate discussion of nuclear theory, except for a couple of moments that we'll discuss later, this is one of them that really summarizes it. Our military understands what happens if you use a nuclear weapon, but they never talk about it. It's not in congressional testimony. It's not in their nuclear posture review. They never talk about what happens if you use these bombs. So here's Julian Osborne, the scientist, saying, yes, they did understand. They didn't want to talk about it. They thought they could control it. They thought that their theories, their science, their command and control mechanisms could control it. And that's the great tragedy of nuclear policy, is we do these things knowing that if we're ever going to use them, they could destroy all of human life on the planet. And we have enough hubris to think that that will never happen, that we have enough safeguards in place.
The danger with this is it destroys, lives like Dwight and Maura, who start to develop a bit more of a relationship. Now, Dwight has potentially something else he could lose, in his life if this mission north doesn't become a success. And even a sadder bit here is Peter and Mary. They start contemplating what they're going to do, because if Peter goes on this, 4-month long mission, what happens if the radiation gets there quicker? So he gets some of these pills that he's hearing rumors about. And what are these pills? They're not iodine tablets. They're not magic radiation pills. They're suicide pills. They cause, as the doctors say, euphoria. They put people into a coma, and then they die. And it's a really sad scene here of Peter trying to convince his wife Mary that, look, if this happens, you need to take the pill, and before you do, you need to give one to our daughter Jennifer.
Now this is a special kind of sleeping pill. I had a devil of a time getting them, but I wanted you to have them on hand and to make sure you knew how to use them. What happens with the radiation is that you get ill. You start feeling sick, and then you are sick. You can't keep anything down. You may feel better for a while, but it always comes back.
And this cures it.
Darling, you know nothing cures it. This ends it.
But Peter, however ill I was, I couldn't do that. Oh, who'd look after Jennifer?
Jenny will get it too.
You're not trying to tell me you want me to kill Jennifer.
Mary, don't be an idiot. Supposing you get it first, what are you going to do then? Struggle on by yourself until you drop? Jenny might live for days and be sick and helpless in her crib with you dead on the floor beside her. Don't you see that? Don't you see it?
Yeah. I mean, this is one of the strengths of the film, actually. It's not a long diatribe on nuclear theory. It's talking about the consequences of nuclear theory, of how you have to confront this, that it doesn't matter whether you're responsible for it or not, whether you should have done something earlier or not. Here you are. And now your choice is how are you going to manage your death? It's a deep existential moment in the film as they discuss this.
It's another one of those multiple meanings of the title of the movie and the book, On the Beach. Kind of where do you do a lot of reflections, but when you're walking on the beach, where do you do the waiting in this movie for the radiation to come, but on the beach? And there's lots of those examples. And I think it really shows that this movie is very contemplative and something that everyone should check out.
Right. So if the ocean is a metaphor for eternity, I mean, here you are on the edge of eternity. You're about to end your life, and you're about to go into the larger, whatever you think awaits you after death. And this is your step. This is your final moments.
One of the steps that they do take is onto the submarine, onto the USS Sawfish, and they go north. They go to the Arctic Circle. They go to do some radiation readings, hoping that everything might be okay. They bring Julian on board the sub because he's a radiation expert and can talk to people about what's going on. Unfortunately, the radiation levels here are even hotter than elsewhere in the Pacific, which means, according to everyone there, things are getting bad, and it's not going to dissipate before it hits Australia. And on the way back south, going to go check out this potential, Morse code signal, one of the scenes I think is very important to kind of stop and do a little bit of conversation about is the USS Sawfish. It takes a second to look through its periscope at San Francisco. One of the scenes I think is very, very powerful is when they take a second to look. They don't see destruction. They don't see the Golden Gate Bridge destroyed. They don't see any of the buildings destroyed. They just see everything empty, as if people, left the city's streets to go somewhere else. And it's clear at a certain point that city is empty and devoid of life it's because people decided they wanted to die of radiation sickness, not in the streets, but in the quiet and privacy of their homes, which I think is a very powerful scene, particularly every moment that's one of the crew members everyone takes a turn and looks into the periscope. Even one of the crew members who's from San Francisco, his parents were there when the war started, even he's allowed a chance to have a second to look. You find out later that he actually escapes the submarine, swims to shore, and then we see him kind of fishing, waiting for the radiation sickness to hit as the submarine leaves, because he's not going to be able to get back on the boat. He's kind of received too much of a dose. What did you think about this scene here in San Francisco, Joe?
Well, again, they're making it personal. The sailor is the every person. How would you respond to this, especially if you're home now? This is his home. In the book, this whole scene plays out in Seattle, but it's the same scenario. The Kramer is very faithful to the book here. The sailor's making a decision. Look, he knows he's going to die. It is coming. Or as they say, we all know we're going to die. Now we just know when we're going to die. And he decides he wants to die at home. And he doesn't want to go in the sub anymore. And in some ways, it's foreshadowing the end of the movie, right, when the entire sub crew makes this decision. And it's poignant. It's human. The commander is not irate that he broke protocol. He's very sympathetic to him. He leaves him in peace, knowing that in a day or two, he's going to have the symptoms of radiation poisoning, will start getting sick. And his final question to him is, do you want a suicide pill? And the guy says, no, I got 200 pharmacies to choose from here. I'll find something.
Yeah, it's a very powerful scene, and it's one of the ones that when I think about this movie, I think about that guy sitting on the boat by himself fishing. Hopefully he caught something before he caught the radiation sickness. I think one of the other really powerful scenes about this, in this particular kind of run of the film, is back aboard the submarine. Everyone is drinking, they're having dinner, and they're having this debate about kind of how the war might have started. And this is one that I think is really important.
Let me correct you there. This is a U.S. submarine. There was no drinking on board. So no one is drinking. Remember at the end?
That's right. They say at some point, can you find something for Julia? That's very true.
So nobody's drinking. This is a very straight-laced American military. By the way, this is 1959. So the U.S. military is still portrayed in very favorable terms. These are people who are still like the heroes of World War II. And everything's by the book. There's no dissent within the military. There's no blame of the military. These guys are the good guys. And you see that play in a very frank and honest discussion.
No, that's perfectly fair, and that it's the Australian that kind of breaks protocol here. And when they ask him kind of what should be blamed, who should be blamed, he jokes. Julian Osborne says that it was Albert Einstein. He's the one to blame. He's the one who started the war. Which is, a fun little reference to him having some support, given his name, his very prominent name, to the original bomb project. But I think this is a great scene to delve into, because Fred Astaire, he really shows his acting chops, and I think one of the best monologues in the movie.
Who would ever have believed that human beings would be stupid enough to blow themselves off the face of the earth? The trouble with you is you want a simple answer, and there isn't any. The war started when people accepted the idiotic principle that peace could be maintained by arranging to defend themselves with weapons they couldn't possibly use without committing suicide. Everybody had an atomic bomb and counter bombs and counter bombs. The devices outgrew us. We couldn't control them. I know. I helped build them. God help me. Somewhere, some poor bloke probably looked at a radar screen and thought he saw something. Knew that if he hesitated 1,000th of a second, his own country would be wiped off the map. So he pushed a button, and the world went crazy.
And then I think the way that they go through this is so really interesting, talking about how, we'd built the bombs, we thought that we'd be able to control them. These were things that we had built up, but then he describes a little scenario. He has no idea whether or not that's actually happened. The scenario he says where some poor bloke probably saw something on a radar screen. He thought he saw something else. He knew that if he hesitated 1,000th of a second, his country would be wiped off the map. So he pushed a button, and then the whole world went crazy. This certainly is drawing from, even if this didn't happen as much, in the public's mind and in public information, by the time this movie was filmed and by the time the book was written, there's lots of examples, right, Joe? Throughout the Cold War, lots of nuclear accidents, near misses, and then some breakdowns and deterrence. This is certainly draws on something that's true.
Yeah. This is so interesting because this is a 1959 film, a 1957 book. And you got to remember the technology we had here. We still were not talking primarily about missiles. There was
Right.
some, but Sputnik had just been launched in 57, right? So we have a few missiles. We haven't even had the debate yet of the Kennedy-Nixon race, where Kennedy says there's a missile gap. We don't have Kennedy's speech at the UN, where he says we all live under the nuclear sword of Damocles that can be cut at any minute by miscalculation, accident, or madness. We don't even have that yet. But he's talking about this here. And we're talking about bombers primarily, like we do in Failsafe, another big epic turning point movie of the time. We're talking about bombers, and this takes place over days and weeks. Actually, in the book, it's described as a 37-day war that happens slowly over time. But it's the same core theory that we're talking about even now. And I find this relevant because there's a lot of movement among nuclear security experts, both my generation, Tim, and yours, who are questioning the theory of deterrence. I mean, really in a profound way now, talking about the validity of just what he says. The idiotic principle, says Fred Astaire, the idiotic principle that peace could be maintained by arranging to defend themselves with weapons they couldn't possibly use without committing suicide. That is our nuclear policy. That is what we believe, that the threat of mutual suicide is so strong that it will prevent anybody from attacking us, but it completely negates the miscalculation, the accident, and as we've just seen with our former president, the madness. And so is this worth it? Is this theory still valid? And this is where Fred Astaire, Julian, goes right into it. It takes us directly into this idea of a miscalculation. He looks at the radar screen, thought he saw something, knew if he hesitated, so he pushes the button. And in the book, it elaborates that they miscalculated. These Egyptians used Russian bombers to attack us. We believe it's the Russians. It's that miscalculation that starts the war. It's the same kind of miscalculation that could happen now, except of course now it's worse, because here we're just talking about sort of honest mistakes. Now in the era of cyber warfare, you could have somebody who's penetrated your system, it's not just an accident like we've had in the past, you were saying, Tim, where we accidentally put training tapes in and the big board lights up and everybody thinks we're actually under attack, or a radar mistakes a rising moon or for an ICBM, or a flock of geese for a Soviet bomber raid, all of which happened, or a computer chip fails and we think we're under attack, all of which happened. No, now in this era, we're talking about somebody with cyber warfare capabilities penetrating our command and control system and doing one of two things, either paralyzing our system, so when we push the button, nothing happens, or taking control of our systems so that when we don't push the button, something happens. This is why so many people are saying that the threats of nuclear war are actually some ways greater now than they were during the Cold War, because we have this intersection of dangerous new technologies that are coming in on top of the already dangerous nuclear weapons and the theory of deterrence that justifies their existence.
And that's one of the things that I try to get out as much as possible anytime we cover these movies that came out during the Cold War, that this is not a documentary that you can say, well, now at the end of the documentary, the problem is over. We fixed it. We did the things we need to do, and the threat that we describe of this quaint time period or moment in time is now gone. These are things that still are concerning for us today. You talked about the fact that the Egyptians in the book had used Soviet bombers and Soviet weapon, designs, made the United States think that the Soviet Union was attacking, that what reminded me of that was the Norwegian rocket incident, which was a weather satellite being launched, but it gave off this very similar signals to an ICBM, and the Soviet Union, was no longer even around anymore when this happened. This was
right, 1994.
Yeah, 94. So this caused a lot of crazy movement. It caused the Chaget, which is the Russian nuclear football, to get activated, and
for the first time,
and very scary. And those are the kinds of miscalculations, in addition to, and that was simply an accident, in addition to any of the other more purposeful, misinformation things you described. And talking here again about like misinformation and not knowing all the facts. When the submarine gets to San Diego, they finally send a crew member They put him in a hazmat suit. They say you have 2 hours, I think they say, to go find the signal and get back before your suit's going to fail and you're not going to have enough protection against the radiation. They're still hoping. Maybe there's someone out there alive. Maybe there's something still to hope for the future. But it turns out what happens, it's a radio room at an oil refinery, and there's a window shade that got caught up on a glass Coke bottle, and that is every time the wind blows, no pun, nuke movie pun intended, when the wind blows, it causes the bottle to hit the Morse code signal, and because they happen to leave, no one turned off the power generators, there's a signal, and then clearly no one's there. The room is empty, and they shut everything off and get back on the submarine.
Window shade tugging on a Coke bottle.
It's very clear. Nothing is going to be able to be done to stop this. It's happening. When they're back in Australia, Maura and Dwight, they start to develop a little bit more of their romantic relationship. They go fishing together.
Puritanism. This is Neil Schutte, the author of the book, was very upset with Stanley Kramer
Hated
for
it.
exactly this. Because in his book, the submarine commander, Dwight, is loyal to his dead wife and kids. And in fact, he acts as if they're still alive. It's the only way he can cope.
He buys a fishing pole, I think, for his kid at one point.
Right.
Yeah.
He's still buying gifts to bring back to them in Mystic. And in the movie, Kramer has them consummate their relationship. Of course, this is 1959. It's very chaste. It's all off screen. You see a passionate kiss, and that's about it. But Schutte was outraged at this. He sort of he broke with Kramer over the way he's portraying the captain. And Kramer's defense is, look, man, this is a 2-hour movie about the end of the world. We have to have some romance in here. And I think he's right.
Very funny that the line there is like, we're okay to show suicide pills and the end of the world, but gosh forbid if someone has a quasi affair with potentially
what? Is it adultery if your wife is dead?
Yeah.
That's what Neil's point of view there. That's right.
Yeah. Well, some people have different reactions to the understanding their fate. I think there's some interesting ones here. Julian Osborne always wanted to race a Ferrari in a big race, so he joins the Australian Grand Prix, and he buys a Ferrari, fixes it up, goes on the race, and everyone else is just driving like they're maniacs, basically, because they've got nothing else to lose. They'd rather die in a big car chase and a big car crash. So he wins the Australian Grand Prix. And then one of the scenes we see him at the end is he, commits suicide by running his car in an engine and gets CO2 poisoning. So that's his way of going out.
Yeah. But just by the way, they throw this car race in there. It's in the movie too, and so it's not a plot device. But it's a little out
Silly.
Of the blue here, but it's exciting. I mean, there's some very big explosions. There are at least 10 cars crash. It reminded me of right before we're recording this, they ran the Daytona 500 on Valentine's Day, and there was a 17-car crack up. So it's a little bit of excitement for the audience to just keep everybody awake during this 2-hour and 13-minute, I think it is.
Yeah.
Film.
It's one of those, if you watch the trailer for this movie, very early in the trailer, you see these car chases and things, and I go, this is not what this movie is, but okay.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
They show you the big explosion. They go, oh, love and explosions. Yeah, I want to go see this movie.
Well, what they don't show you is the more depressing stuff, which is Mary and Peter, very clear that they took the pills. They both come to accept their fate, and they take the pills, and that's kind of their way of avoiding, the radiation damage. I think a very powerful scene. It's an outdoor religious ceremony. There's a very large crowd convened by the Salvation Army under a banner that says, "There is still time, brother." And the speaker is asking for everyone to give forgiveness before things get really bad. And that's when you start to see in the background people passing out these pills. These suicide pills. And then a couple, not very much longer, a couple days later, the same thing is happening again, but the crowd is maybe a third?
Oh, even less. Yeah, it's a pathetic remnants of the throng that was there earlier in the film.
And as you kind of, hinted at, we don't see what happens to Maura. We can kind of get a sense, we know what happens to her in the book, but what happens with Dwight and Maura, you think maybe they are going to have a chance to kind of spend a little bit more time together after their very controversial consummation. But what happens is Dwight's crew on the submarine, on the USS Sawfish, they all vote just to decide that they would like to go back to Connecticut. They like to go back to the United States. And even though they know this is how they'll die, but this is on their own terms, and Dwight agrees. He says, I'm not just going to let this crew go without me. He gets on the submarine, and one of the last shots is of Maura kind of watching this on a cliff side, watching the submarine go off in the distance. And I think right in the book, you actually see her taking her pill, her suicide pill with some brandy, and watching Dwight, instead of him going back home, they all decide to scuttle the ship because they can't let the ship go into the hands of someone, but they decide that's kind of how they're going to go about. So they scuttle the ship, and that's how they meet their end. It's a series of very difficult shots, and the last one in particular is Melbourne. It's empty, similar to what we saw earlier with San Francisco. You would assume at this point the radiation is hit, and no one's left. And the banner from earlier, the one that says "There's still time, brother," is still there, flapping in the wind, but no one's there in the movie to listen. But I think it's very clear that the message was not for the people of Melbourne, but for those still watching the movie. Ends a bit on a hopeful note for us, at least watching, hopefully that we can do what we can to not let this become a reality.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, this movie is played out like, war games about stopping nuclear terrorism. I don't know if you've ever done any of these, but in all the games I've played, you try to stop a terrorist from blowing up a nuclear device in New York or Washington, and of course you fail because it's much easier for a terrorist to do this than it is for us to stop it. But the point of the war game is to say, well, what should we have done? How could we have stopped this previously? What could we have done in our policies now to stop that from ever happening in reality? And that's Kramer's message, right? There's still time, brother. You can do something about it. And it plays over this very sad and poignant ending. Most of us, if we had to choose between love and ending our lives in a loving embrace with someone we loved, or going on a submarine with a bunch of men to your certain death, we would have chosen love. But Dwight chooses duty over love. And so that's one of the choices, duty over love. He wants to stay, but he decides he has a duty to the crew. And in some ways, Kramer's sort of hitting on that. Look what happens, when you do that, when we all just do our duty. And when I saw the ending, I was reminded of Maura's comments at the end of the party. Didn't they understand what was going to happen? If they had these bombs, it's, oh no, we understood. She then furthers that discussion is, but it's basically, it's not our fault.
But it's unfair. It's unfair because I didn't do anything. And nobody I know did anything.
And that has a double meaning. It's like trying to interpret what's going on in WandaVision. What are the double meanings of the dialogue here? Well, one meaning is it's not our fault. But the other meaning is we didn't do anything to stop it. We didn't do anything. And so his message at the end is to the people watching it. Do something about this. There's still time, brother.
And that is definitely a Stanley Kramer movie. That's how he rolls with his films. And I think it's fascinating to watch now because you talk about this movie being a time capsule. It's definitely also a time capsule in how movies were made, in terms of how movies end with the big, I think it's like a big like crashing sound while the banner's there. So it's like, if you didn't get what we were saying, here it is.
That was my one big criticism of the movie. I liked the score. The score is extremely poignant. Basically, the score is variations of Waltzing Matilda, which is one of the most evocative, poignant melodies and songs of all time. And they use it throughout the movie, and they play it again at the end, and then he closes with this big crash over and it was just jarring and overly dramatic. And I didn't like the feeling it left me. And a number of the critics talked about the movie ending. What was the phrase? Like a leaden shroud?
Yeah. Heavily laden shroud. That's how the movie is done.
Yeah. That's it. If you can turn the volume down at the end of the movie, I think you'll like the ending a little better.
Yeah. I'll just, next time I show it to someone, I'll just kind of mute that at the very end. No, Waltzing Matilda was a great motif to play throughout this, because if you just focus on certain lyrics, it's very haunting, but it depends if you sing it in a very, happy way, it's very different. It's a great one that could be used. The end of the TV show, I don't know if you watch Deadwood on HBO, it's one of my favorite shows. They end as well with that song being played. So I had to think about that when I was watching this movie. So there's a few other, nuclear plot stuff I think it's really worth getting into in the little bit of time we have left here. One thing that people ask me a lot every time I have a conversation about this movie is the science behind the radioactive fallout cloud. Because I think this sometimes is a bit of a holdup for people, and it was something that a lot of the official critics, the military advisors who didn't want this movie to be released, people at the Pentagon, or others that were not particularly happy with its message that deterrence could fail, or just in general these days, people wonder, is this something that could actually happen? Could there be a nuclear war in the North and literally everywhere around the world is destroyed? And I think it's really interesting. It's certainly a very shocking plot for its time. These things were in people's minds with nuclear testing in the atmosphere. We got the Castle Bravo incident in 1954, so right around that time period when the book was being written. And this still was not a very common occurrence, though, in Hollywood movies. Those kind of big things where humanity would be destroyed by weapons, created and used by the United States. So it's very, very, very controversial. But I think it's interesting because the bombs in the movie aren't particularly described to be anything different than what we normally would have in the arsenal. In the book, they're described to be cobalt laced, cobalt salted bombs. And I think it's really interesting because this comes up a lot in other nuclear science fiction or nuclear plot films. And I think it's worth talking about a little bit here, because could there be a nuclear war that causes radioactive fallout around the world? Maybe, but the science there is not completely confirmed on it. But I know you have a lot of thoughts on, nuclear winter, which is a distinct from, radioactive fallout that would go around the world. So I just want to mention here a little bit about cobalt bombs, because they discuss this in the book as what the weapon designers have been created. Because again, this is a movie that takes place a little bit further into the future. Same thing with the book, took place a little bit in the future. So these were things that Leo Szilard, who you mentioned earlier, he had talked about cobalt bombs back in 1950, and the idea here is you take a normal thermonuclear bomb, you lace the warhead with some cobalt metal, and then when there's an explosion, the fusion reaction produces a lot of neutrons. Those will transmute the cobalt into cobalt-60. And the unique thing about cobalt-60 is it has a pretty long half-life of 5.7 years. You could actually create your bomb so that there's more radiation than there is blast damage. So you could potentially have a bomb that destroys and kills people with the radioactivity over a certain amount of time. But, in 5.7 years, maybe you can go and claim that territory. What Leo Szilard was talking about was theoretically, what if we created a couple of these bombs, and even without, blast damage into cities being destroyed, it's still pretty dangerous. So it was more of like a theoretical idea, but there were some examples of people wanting to use these bombs and to develop them. They never were actually built or deployed, but you have some examples here of someone that wanted to use these?
Yes, we do. So let's just do a little bit of the science. Some of the materials in the weapons have very long half-lives. A half-life is basically, during this period, half of the material will decay into non-radioactive substances. And then over the remaining period, another half of the remaining material will decay, et cetera, et cetera. So plutonium has a half-life of 26,000 years. What that means is it lasts for a long, long time, but it's not that radioactive. It's not that deadly. Whereas some of the fission materials produced in the explosion have very, very short half-lives, and they're intensely radioactive, intense gamma radiation, and that's what kills most people. But those tend to have half-lives of weeks. So and that's why fallout shelters will work. If you can stay underground for a week or so, when you would come back up, most of the radiation would have dissipated. So cobalt is in the middle. So as you say, 5.7 years. So that's a long time. And then but half of it would be gone. Well, then the other half would be gone. So about 20 years in, the cobalt would have dissipated. And so some military commanders thought that this was the perfect weapon, because you could kill people with radiation, but the nuclear explosion wouldn't have devastated the buildings, the infrastructure. And so General MacArthur, when he was commanding U.S. troops in Korea, for example, proposed using 60 cobalt bombs to lay down a radioactive belt between North Korea and what's now North Korea and China to prevent the Chinese from coming in. It was actually one of the reasons that Truman ended up firing MacArthur. And if you just Google MacArthur cobalt, you'll come up with the whole story about this. A truly insane idea. And so insane that despite all the crazy things the United States and other countries have done, we've never built cobalt bombs. Nobody's ever actually done it. That was the worry. And when Leo Szilard was talking about this in 1950, he was showing, remember, so the bomb had just been around by about 4 or 5 years by that point. And he's saying, look, this is going to get worse. Other technologies will come in on top of the nuclear threat to make these already terrible weapons even more terrible. And of course, a few years after he made this, we developed the hydrogen bomb, which is many times more powerful than the fission bombs, the atomic bombs. And other technologies have indeed come on, ICBMs, et cetera, now cyber war, to make this nuclear threat even more dangerous than it is. And that we so clearly saw and tragically saw demonstrated in Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
And this was certainly not only a concern for Leo and the people that were concerned about the bomb that were former weapons scientists. This was something that was really a big worry within Australia, within the public. Because in the 1950s, the US and the UK, particularly the UK, started doing nuclear tests in Australia.
Yes.
At a nuclear test site there, the Maralinga test site. And when they decided to do their first tests, obviously this is something that's going to be in the news and news reports for the public, because they're going to start testing nuclear weapons on site here. That's pretty interesting for the public to newsworthy item. There were lots of unconfirmed reports that maybe the first test at this site would be a cobalt bomb. Immediately, they tried to put out some reports, that the official reports that said, no, we're not going to do this. It's not going to be a cobalt bomb. But even those news reports were always included a couple quotes, including some from Albert Einstein, that talked about how bad cobalt bombs would be, that they would be sufficient to extinguish life from the Earth, capable of wiping human life from the globe, most dangerous lasting nuclear explosive ever invented. So you would say it's not going to be the test, but look how bad cobalt bombs are. So you combine these things together, no doubt in my mind, at least, that this was something that influenced the plot of this particular film. You find cobalt, and also of the book. Yeah, you find cobalt bombs a lot and other stuff. You mentioned Dr. Strangelove earlier. They kind of invent their own bomb here, the Cobalt Thorium G.
Oh yes, for the Doomsday Machine. Yes.
Yep. You've obviously never heard of Cobalt Thorium G.
Well, what about it?
Cobalt Thorium G has a radioactive half-life of 93 years. If you take, say, 50 H-bombs in 100 megaton range and jacket them with Cobalt Thorium G, when they are exploded, they will produce a doomsday shroud.
It's also a plot point in the very interesting but not necessarily great movie Beneath the Planet of the Apes. There's a cobalt bomb there. It's also in Goldfinger, the James Bond film.
Right. Goldfinger makes a passing reference to his cobalt bomb. Yes, that's right.
As you mentioned, it's never been developed, so it's not something that we really have to worry about. What we do have to worry about is global nuclear winter, because that's certainly more of a bigger concern. But it's harder plot to show in a movie in 1959. But you want to talk a little bit about this? Is certainly
I do. So let's talk about the science here. So could radioactivity distinguish all life on Earth? Well, if Albert Einstein said it, I mean, who am I to disagree? But it would be really hard to do, frankly. And there's a lot of interesting science here. For example, it's true that a nuclear war in the Northern Hemisphere, the radioactivity would stay in the Northern Hemisphere because winds do not cross the equator. Kind of interesting. Mm-hmm. And it would take some time, because it turns out as the Earth tilts, you go through the seasons, the weather pattern shifts, some of the weather does cross the equator, some of that radioactivity would come down, but that helps explain why it would take a long time. All that is true. And in the book, by the way, he describes it in much more detail. So
he mentions like New Zealand and South Africa and a few other places have been known to be okay. Like there are getting reports that there are still people alive there, but the movie simplifies it.
As again, the scientist Julian Osborne says, when somebody says, these weapons could destroy the Earth, and he says, no, not the Earth. The Earth will be fine. It's us that will be gone, and that's true. We often talk about blowing up the planet. Well, you can't actually blow up the planet. But if you look about how many weapons it would take to destroy, so let's say all human life in the United States, if you Google effects of nuclear war, you will quickly come up to an ACTA study done, the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, and they estimated about 1,000 large thermonuclear devices used in the United States would destroy most life in the United States. And I think that's accurate. Mm-hmm. But the whole thing, the combination of blast and fire and, of course, radioactivity would destroy most life. Could you kill all life on Earth from nuclear explosions with radioactivity? Probably not.
But what about nuclear winter? That's certainly.
But here's where you get, and this is what's changed. If you were doing this now, you would be this would be a nuclear winter film, because climate science was still very primitive in the 50s and 60s, until very recently, actually. But now with the climate science we have and the supercomputers that we use to calculate this, we now know, and one of our colleagues, Alan Robach, is working on a big multi-year study of this, that as few as 100 nuclear weapons used in a nuclear war between India and Pakistan in South Asia would burn enough material in the densely populated cities of South Asia that it would put smoke and particulates in the atmosphere that would cover the Earth in a shroud for 2 to 3 years, dropping global temperatures about 2 or 3 degrees. And before you think this might be a solution to global warming, you drop global temperatures 2 or 3 degrees and you kill about 40% of the food crops in the world. And you do that and you unleash a famine that's probably going to kill a billion people, scientists calculate. You do that and you've introduced an instability into human civilization that probably brings about the collapse of human civilization as we know it. As, by the way, if you study the fall of civilizations, an increasingly popular topic these days, you will see that quite often climate change and food scarcity triggers the collapse of civilizations. And we now have in our hands the ability to change the Earth's climate, either slowly over decades and centuries, as we're doing with industrial pollutants, or overnight, as we would do with even a small nuclear war. So yes, nuclear weapons, even a relatively small amount of 100 or so. Remember, we have about 6,000 nuclear weapons. Russia has about 6,000 nuclear weapons. India and Pakistan have about 300 total between them. Even 100 nuclear weapons could change the climate and kill billions of people and cause the collapse of civilization. Could you actually get the scenario like on the beach where all human life quietly dies, orderly, lined up, everybody, no riots? I don't think so. I don't think so. But as a sort of a simplification of the threat, an artistic presentation of the threat, you'd have to say that this is essentially accurate.
If you want a realistic portrayal of nuclear winter and how it breaks down civilization, you watch Threads and you try to deal with that movie. That's a film that describes what happens over 13 years of a nuclear war in the United Kingdom. It's very devastating and very difficult to get through. But I think, as you really you nailed it here, this movie cares a little bit less about the science of the portrayal of radioactivity, because it is, I think, honestly more of like an allegorical story, or more even poetry of, here's what characters are responding to their fates. They reflect, they respond, they ultimately kind of accept their fate, that this is going to end up happening. And I think this is important because while you're right that, nuclear winter would be a concern, but it wouldn't look this way, and the fallout wouldn't be as radioactive and for people in Australia, it's trying to show, like, what we should be concerned about is we have time now. We have time to be able to kind of deal with some of these issues before this kind of war, ends up happening. But if we're not going to do anything about it, we're all basically still sitting and reflecting on our fate. It just happens to be maybe a little bit longer than the people in this film have. So I think this is one of those movies where if I was really being super critical about it, I would say, well, this has never really happened. But I don't think the movie's trying to be that accurate. It's trying to, scare people into showing them how this could happen. And this is what even people who were in the movie, like Ava Gardner, she mentioned this. She says after she saw the movie, she said it's a fictional scenario, but my God, everyone in the cast and crew knew a nuclear war could happen. I was proud of being part of this film, proud of what it said. And I think that is one of the reasons why I'm glad that you really finally got me to do this particular movie. It's been a while. I've been nervous to cover it because it's hard to kind of get through it. It's a really important one to be able to talk about.
Yeah.
It almost didn't happen. The U.S. Navy, the Eisenhower administration at the time really fought against this movie from being made. And funny enough, they didn't really care that much about the book, but they knew book is different than a film. Film has much more of a visceral, visual kind of impact on people. And according to the book by Joyce Evans, which is called Celluloid, Mushroom Clouds, Hollywood, and the Atomic Bomb, every studio in the 50s and the 60s normally would ask the Pentagon for help for making your movie about war. The Pentagon would get script approval, and then the Hollywood would be able to get access to the cool toys that can actually make their movie look realistic. Oh, when the Pentagon was asked for this film, they said no. They wanted to be able to cut most of the plot. They didn't want the idea that nuclear deterrence could break down. They didn't like the fact that it wasn't clear who started the war. They didn't want the United States to be the one to look like maybe they had some hand, in starting this. So this was one of those things that led Kramer, he said, I needed a nuclear atomic submarine for the film, but the Pentagon told me, no, your story says an atomic war would wipe out the world, and that isn't so. Only about 500 million people would be killed.
Yeah.
And I told them that's the closest I would ever like to get to a total wipeout. So we wouldn't change the script, so we didn't get the atomic sub.
Yeah, right. I'm not saying we wouldn't get our hair mussed,
yeah.
Right? But it's not everybody. It's only 500 million. Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's barely even, a couple mega deaths. So this is, I think it's what's so fascinating. They were able to get some military props. They got a diesel sub from the Australian Navy, which is, nice for them to be able to help out with that. It is certainly interesting because even the Eisenhower administration kind of had a lot of pushback on this. I did not know about this until I started to do research for this, but there was even a cabinet level meeting in December 1959.
Oh, tell me about this.
There was a cabinet level meeting in 1959 that was headed up by Richard Nixon, who was vice president at the time. And they got together to talk about what they should do about this film because it was going to be a big release. Six continents, 18 theaters around the world at the same time, which was a big release back then. And it got to the point where they were debating what they should do about this. And the chief of the U.S. Information Agency, he was so concerned by this. He said that the quote, unprecedented publicity given to the movie meant that we should care that the government officials do not give support to an erroneous themes developed in the film. This official even said that the government's primary concern was that there was this resigned, defeatist nature in the film's treatment of global thermonuclear war. Like, nothing we can do about this. This is so bad, and we're just going to let this happen, but that's not what they wanted to do. And they thought that they could handle these kinds of issues. And it even got to the point where, you mentioned, fallout shelters earlier. Well, the guy who was heading up the country's civil defense program, trying to build shelters, encourage people to prepare because they could respond if you were prepared. You can deal with the fallout for these kind of bombs. They said, quote, that the film was regarded as something very harmful because it produced a feeling of utter hopelessness, thus undermining his efforts to encourage preparedness on the part of all citizens. It was one of those movies that would cut against the idea that nuclear war could be survived, and therefore maybe you won't. If you think your solution to this is either to get on a submarine and hide out for a while, or to take a poison pill and not deal with civil defense, then maybe we won't be supporting the war effort as much.
Let me just talk about this for a minute on two aspects. One, I was 9 years old when this movie came out, so I'm a generation ahead of you. So this was these books, these movies. My parents were reading these. In fact, shortly thereafter, Failsafe came out, and this was my first memory of my exposure to nuclear weapons was reading the serialized version of Failsafe in the Saturday Evening Post.
Wow.
Which doesn't exist anymore, but by the way, plays a role in the book, the Saturday Evening Post. So I remember sitting on my living room floor reading Failsafe, another profoundly sad, intensely personal nuclear tragedy. And these things, these movies, these books, they moved public opinion, right? If we had a movie like On the Beach or a book like On the Beach now, we would love it in our field. Who's writing this book? Who's doing this movie? The closest you come is probably Eric Schlosser with Command and Control, which was made into a PBS movie and had a book that had a lot of circulation and a lot of policymakers read, but nothing like this, right? Nothing like this. But these things were happening then. This was a critical time in public opinion. And here's our military, this is the second point, deciding that they don't like this theme, that this is not helpful to the military mission, to the image of the military, to U.S. national security policy. And you got to say, well, why not? What's going on here? What values do they have? Shouldn't our government be supporting films that oppose nuclear war? Shouldn't it be our position that a nuclear war can never be won and should never be fought, as Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev said? Isn't that what our government policy should be? So when you have a movie like this that's showing that any use of nuclear weapons is suicidal, isn't that a good message for the government? But it isn't. That isn't how the military thinks, because when you get right down to it, the military doesn't want to support films that questions their weapons, their strategy, their tactics, even if there's a greater good to be served, even if there's a valid moral point to be made, because they believe that their strategy and tactics work. And I think it gets actually a little sicker than that, because when you get up close and personal with nuclear commanders and the guys who head the Global Strike Command or STRATCOM, and you look at their ethos, and you look at their slogans, and you look at their symbols, you look at their films, you look at their Twitter thread, and these guys promote nuclear weapons. They believe, they make secretaries of defense. We'll see if Austin follows this mode. Go out to Grand Forks, go out to Omaha, and proclaim that nuclear weapons are the backbone of American national security policy, the foundation, our essential weapons, when, of course, this is the opposite of what's true. Nuclear weapons are not our ultimate security. They are our ultimate threat. But the military is so wed to the weapons, to the missions, to the bases, that's what they defend. And they've lost all sight of the goal, which is to preserve our society, preserve our civilization, preserve our morality. You know, there's a reason that Pope Francis says nuclear weapons are immoral, that the possession of nuclear weapons, just the possession of them, is immoral and is not justified by anything, including deterrence. It is immoral to threaten the mass extinction of innocent men, women, and children in the name of defense of our country. That's what the Pope says. Why doesn't our military embrace this? Well, that's a whole other subject. That's a whole other subject. But it's about money. It's about contracts. It's about mission. It's not about what's best for the country.
And this was all of the debates that they were having behind the scenes at the Pentagon and the White House here, how they were going to respond, because whether it was a campaign to discredit Kramer as maybe this is just the kind of message that the Soviet Union would want the American public to know about, thinking that maybe nuclear weapons are something that you should try to avoid, so therefore maybe there's less support for advancing the U.S. arsenal, while at the same time the Russian arsenal gets better. That was the message that the Pentagon was trying to put out there, why this film was dangerous. In addition to, if you don't let us have civil defense programs that make people think that you could survive a nuclear war, they might be less reluctant to letting you continue to test in places like Australia and later in Nevada and in the Pacific and everything. It is very, very fascinating that, maybe the portrayal of the movie, the idea of a fallout cloud destroying the world and everywhere, the science of that maybe isn't completely accurate. Their way they were pushing was that their internal report said that most fallout would be in the area, the northern hemisphere. There might be some collateral damage from neighboring countries. So even they talked about there would be, radiation doesn't care about borders. Very similar that COVID doesn't care about borders. It goes to wherever it needs to because it doesn't think about these things. It's just they were able to kind of pick at that a little bit. And
let's just remember that they were also denying that atmospheric testing was bad.
Right.
Babies are being born now with genetic conditions created by the fallout from these nuclear weapons. I mean, this is still going on. This is the thing about nuclear weapons. The environmental damage they do is generational. And whether it's the Navajos who mined the uranium from the earth, or it's the downwinders, this stuff lasts for a very long time. It's true there's not mass death like on the beach, but a speck of plutonium, a pinhead size of plutonium ingested will give you cancer. You won't die from that speck, but it will kill you. He won't die immediately from that speck, but it will kill you in the long run. So this is part of what the military wants to do. Everything's fine here, nothing to see, move along.
And I think the best way to wrap this up is I love the quote. He's only in one scene. So it's a naval, doctor who's helping on the USS Sawfish. After they came back, people are starting to get sick. The first guy who gets sick on the crew, Dwight says, "Why? Why now? Why all of a sudden?" And the doctor says,
"Why? Why not? It's here. Hit somebody first. Hit this lad. We're not machines. We're not going to fall over in rows,
And it's not going to get any better. It's not just a drunken night of cards off the boat. It's something it's going to start happening here, and I think that's one of the more also powerful scenes in the film.
Yeah,
I appreciate the thorough talk here about the film and the nuclear plots, but still we have to, every episode we do a rating system here where we rate the film out of 5, with 1 being kind of a worst film you would never recommend to anybody and 5 being terrific. But I like to tailor the rating system based on the plot we have here. If I get super critical about that, I'm gonna probably do the same thing on our rating system. So I tailored it up a little bit and I said let's rate On the Beach on a scale of 1 out of 5 Coke bottles on a Morris key. If you got just one Coke bottle tapping away, you might occasionally get a word out there that is, makes sense, and maybe someone will come and help you. But if you've got 5, you can probably step away for a little while and do whatever you need to, and you'll eventually randomly get some words, and people may end up being able to send some help here. I rate this 4 Coke bottles on a Morse code. I think it's a seminal movie. Anyone that is interested in this genre or anyone that works in this field should watch this film. The ending really hits home. It has a big impact on everybody. I think, to me, it's just, we mentioned, it's a little long. It's a movie from 1959. At sometimes the characters can feel a little bit odd and off, and I think that it's just the one thing that kind of keep this as a movie for me, and I'm like, everyone needs to see it, but I think anyone in our field really absolutely should, and particularly the book. The book is great. I'm really finally glad I got around to reading this book over Christmas break here, and I'm happy that it's here, but it is, as you mentioned, the ending of the big shouting score at the very end just kind of makes it a little bit hard to watch, and I think that's why audiences maybe weren't as receptive to it. Not necessarily the anti-nuclear war message, but it was just like a Kramer movie, a little bit too preachy. I don't feel that as much, but I can understand why not everyone want to watch it. But I do recommend this as something that everyone needs to see. What about you, Joe?
Well, I'm going to be a little more generous than you, but just a bit more. I'm going to give it 4.5 Coke bottles.
One of the bottles broke.
because it's not a 5. I mean, this is not a Doctor Strangelove movie, but it is so, and it's dated, obviously. I watched in one sitting. It's on YouTube. It's extremely easy to watch, and it flows and it moves along, and the pacing was fine. And I'm also into old movies lately. I'm not sure why. I mean, there's so much material that's coming out every day, right? I can't watch the new movies, the new series that are coming out, and yet I find myself being drawn to just watch Network, for example, which is an earlier, one of the first movies to warn about the effect of media on public consciousness here. I just saw an early movie with Ingrid Bergman and done by Robert Rossellini about Italian refugees after the war. It's called Stromboli, which is a fascinating film to see. I just watched a Charlie Chaplin film from 1914 called The Immigrant, which was really interesting to see how we're dealing with immigration during these waves of immigration that were coming into the country then. So that's the time capsule. It brings you back there. This movie, on those sort of historic basis, as well as the artistic basis, and for me, the political impact of this film and the book make it a 4.5 star movie. If you are concerned about nuclear policy and nuclear strategy and nuclear history, this has got to be on your must-see list.
And like Network, if we were to open up our windows and start shouting things out into the crowd, one thing I'd like to shout out to people is something else. If they want to watch something that's related to On the Beach or read more about the topics that were covered in this movie, I've got a couple things to recommend, and I see you as well have got a few on here, so I'll just do mine real quick. I recommend an article by Beverly Gray called The Continuing Relevance of On the Beach, published in August 3rd, 2015 in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist. It's a great depiction and discussion of On the Beach from someone who made films and kind of the impact that particular movie has had on them and their filmmaking perspective. There's a documentary called Fallout, which is a really hard one to get because it's an Australian documentary, but it's from 2013. It's by Lawrence Johnson, and it's on the writing of the book and the making of the movie, but it goes into great detail about the movie as a time capsule for that particular period. And I also recommend, if you have access to a VR headset or any sort of, I think it's on YouTube, but it doesn't come across as well. There's a great 2015 documentary called Collisions, and it's about an Aboriginal man in Australia whose first interaction at all with the Western world was witnessing one of those secret United Kingdom nuclear tests in Australia in the 1950s. Did not know what this thing was. Imagine seeing a mushroom cloud rising from the ground, not knowing at all what was, and didn't know for years what it was. And this is a great documentary that interviews this gentleman and kind of describes in great detail kind of what he thought. So I think that's particularly relevant here. But Joe, what would you shout from your window that people should check out?
I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. Oh, wait, that's from Network. I love your recommendations, and Collisions is a particularly effective and evocative film. I guess it's a film. It's short, but it's
like 15 minutes.
Powerful.
Yeah, it's good.
I saw it with a VR headset, and it was just terrific. In the realm of sort of documents, go Google the effects of nuclear war. and you will get up this. This one is done by the Office of Technology Assessment, The Effects of Nuclear War, 20 years after the movie, 1979. And it still explains in great detail what actually happens here in nuclear war. What is the fire? What's the blast? What's the radioactivity? So it's the kind of document you want to read if you're in this field and see what they said. I'm not sure that actually, I take that back. I'm not sure there are better, more modern versions of this, but it'd be interesting. Yeah, well, this is great. And this is when Congress had its own scientific and technological advisory group, the Office of Technology Assessment. And it was because of things like this, and more particularly one they did years later, not too long later, on ballistic missile defense, that caused the Republicans under Newt Gingrich, when they took control of the House, to disband OTA. And I don't know why Nancy Pelosi hasn't put this back in, but that she should. She should resurrect the Office of Technology Assessment. Congress needs its own scientific and technology advisory group. And that's what OTA was. And they produced seminal studies that people are still recommending, like me, now, 50 years after they were published. Okay.
So what else?
So I would go with this movie, 7 Days in May. This is, you've reviewed this, I know, in your podcast before. It's a great film. I've always liked it. Burt Lancaster is the head of the Joint Chiefs, and he plots a coup. That's something we've been considering lately. This couldn't possibly happen here. A coup against the president of the United States. Why? Because he's engaged in an arms control treaty with the evil Soviet Union.
Great film.
And he's against this. And Kirk Douglas is the hero that thwarts the coup. And finally, this is the one I wanted to discuss with you, Tim, but you've already done it, which is Them. Again, one of these early science fiction movies that showed the consequences of nuclear testing. And it was depicting allegorically, as you say, the threats of nuclear weapons, in this case, the giant ants mutating out of the test tunnels in the Nevada desert, a theme that you saw in the 50s and 60s, that radioactivity would cause mutations. Godzilla, and a beast from 2,000 fathoms, monsters generated. So the monster, of course, is the nuclear weapons. What have we done? Here they come to get us. Them is also notable, by the way, for the first known screen appearance of...
Yeah, Leonard Nimoy. He's in the
background. Leonard Nimoy comes in. He has one line. He hands a fax to the commanding general. That's it. It's a walk-on roll. He's in and out.
Weirdly enough, still had pointy ears in that one. I don't know why.
So those are my recommendations. Effects of Nuclear War, Failsafe. Oh, yes, I forgot. Failsafe. Go watch the original Failsafe or the George Clooney remake. Again, terrific movies on the unintended consequences of our existing nuclear posture.
Well, I know when you were at Ploughshares, we had a couple movie nights of watching Godzilla and other films. So maybe we can try to arrange that again when we can all get back together after COVID vaccines are out there to watch them. I think people should check that movie out because it's a great one.
Great. Well, Tim, thank you so much for having me on. This was a lot of fun, and thank you for making me spend some focused time and attention on this great book and this great movie.
So where can people follow you more? Some of your thoughts maybe on Them or this movie or anything else that pops up. I know you're at Cirincione on Twitter. Any other projects you wanted to let people know about?
Well, as soon as we finish, I have to go write a new article on what the heck Joe Biden thinks he's doing on Iran policy. And I publish a lot these days at the website of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. It's called, imaginatively enough, Responsible Statecraft, which, by the way, is a terrific site. I admire what the Quincy Institute has done over there, creating this forum for thinking outside the blob, as they like to put it. So you can catch most of my publications these days are up there. I'm still active. I'm still doing things. I just no longer have an organization to run.
It's a lot of time to watch more movies and have a lot more thinking time, which is great. So thanks again for coming on here.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you for being so super critical.
I do my best. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Supercritical Podcast. If you have any suggestions for future episodes, or you want to tell us what we got wrong, either about the geography of Melbourne or maybe the nuclear content, a couple ways you can let me know about that. I'm on Twitter at Nuclear Podcast. I've got an email account, supercriticalpodcast@gmail.com, and the website, supercriticalpodcast.com, where we put all of our show notes and other resources up here. So feel free to check that out as well. Until next time, this has been Tim Westmyer.
And Joe Cirincione.
And remember, if it's pop culture and radioactive, we are bound to get super critical about it. Have a good one.